I'm really honored to be talking to this group. It's not very often that I talk about these projects with a group of people who already deeply understand what we're talking about here and know so much of the vocabulary of systems and networks and the issues that we're facing today. So I am thankfully building on my presenters before me, and I'm followed by colleague Rick Reed on a panel who is also going to be talking about a different dimension of the REAMP project. Because there is so many factors that we're talking about today and in this conference that we tried to bake into the REAMP project. And I'm going to focus on operationalizing the network. So taking a lot of the ideas that we all have been working with and experimenting with, this experiment was really started by asking the question, and this is an abbreviated version of the Garfield Foundation. Really, Jenny Curtis, who's here, and Rick Reed asked, what would it look like if we tried to apply a systems approach to philanthropy and working with funders and advocates around sustainability issues? Could we accelerate progress? Could we take all of this great work that's being done in all these little separate pieces and see if the sum would be greater than the parts? And so that's what we audaciously set out to do together. I was invited in to advise about how to go from what was discovered in the work that Scott collaborated with and looking at the systems analysis and ask, okay, how do we take that information and actually operationalize it? What do we do with these understandings? And using for me, a familiar model, and it was familiar to Rick and Jenny, of looking at defining a system and the process of starting from really understanding the system and building through that. And that's really what we set out to do in a much more messy pathway than what this looks like. Fundamentally, what we started with is that the structure of how we work together had to be deeply embedded in understanding the system. Those two, we were going to try and put those together. Systems theory, network concepts into the very structure and practices that we worked with. So as all of you are very familiar, we came to a lot of our systems understanding over time through sort of what we as humans discovered and evolved. And we're really at this place of taking so much of what we learned through all of this and applying it into really on-the-ground action. So the network really was a design for system change. And what we understand in systems theory and networks is that in human systems, the purpose determines the structure. And so understanding what we were setting out to do together was really critical. And we were fortunate, and I'll show you how we got to this. The REAMP network really embedded that thinking in what became one of our mottos: think systemically, act collaboratively. And we tried to put that up with our logo everywhere to remind people that there was never there can never be a disconnect between those concepts. And at the root, they were part of what we always thought about in designing and making decisions about our next step. So as Scott fortunately went through the description of the systems mapping process that took place, Garfield and Rick invited a group of advocates together to, I'm going to shorten this story because I think Rick will touch on it a little bit more, and went through this process. It was a process of conversation, of understanding together and developing a sense of all the different pieces that each of them working in their separate domains really were looking at together. And from that understanding of the system, we're able to align around a long-term goal. And the importance of that alignment was critical, again, in designing how we were going to work together. We knew that we were headed in the same direction. And because we knew that and we understood the system we were working in together, it gave us a lot of space for creativity. We weren't always trying to figure out, now, is this going to take us where we're going? We knew already and had that shared agreement on the directionality of our work. And as Scott mentioned, out of the systems mapping, there was also an agreement based on everybody's expertise and outside analysis that the high leverage areas of the system needed to be acted upon simultaneously, as Scott mentioned about shutting coal plants. That was actually a big also framing of what became our structure, because we knew that in working in this complex system, we had to have a design of a network in which there were people working on different parts of the system, but they had alignment and they weren't canceling out each other's work. So those main leverage points from the original map actually brought us to our first structure, and that is that the advocates and funders in the room self-organized, really based on their expertise and interest, into working groups where they started doing the strategic planning, looking at that long-term goal and saying, what is it going to take for our node in this network to move in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years towards that goal? So there was a long process of the groups getting together and inviting in other people that they felt needed to be at the table. And the leadership process was I think, very emergent as well. It was a combination of the original people, inviting people to come forward based on a sense that these were people who were about bringing together others into a conversation. They had fundamentally the characteristics of someone who knew that we were all going to think better together, and that it wasn't about their organization or their issue, but fundamentally we had to be working simultaneously and iterating and learning together. And so the beginning of the structure of the network became these emergent leaders in these different domains, along with foundations who had agreed to sit at the table and see this experiment to the next step. And over time, we developed, with that group of people, emergent structures to the network as it evolved and those functions were needed. As people started to wonder the next step, we again went back to our systems principles and concepts and talked about what does this need. One of the key concepts that we always worked with, obviously from the systems principles, is that the infrastructure needed to remain distributed, the leadership, the capacities, the functions, and that we should try and keep it as minimal as possible so that there was always flexibility, There was always the ability to move as things emerged, and critically, that we could support shared assets in and around the network, but not. We have always tried to mitigate against the natural tendency of people working together to start to centralize leadership, centralize resources, and build some kind of organization or hub that starts to take away from the growth and capacity building throughout all of the network. And it's not an easy thing to continue to do. There's tension there all the time, which is good creative tension. But we implemented that in the governance structure. We started having democratic elections from the working groups to place people on what became the steering committee. Eventually, we needed some staff to support, and over time, staff was hired and distributed in member organizations, even though they were serving the whole network. We went to a shared story. I'm actually going to walk through some of these, so I won't go through them all now. But these were some of the critical things that we built and embedded into the structure of how people worked. The shared story, that was one of the first things that we realized we needed to learn how to talk about what we were doing together. We needed to learn how to express the goal in a way that was something accessible to people first just within the network and the network organizations, and then later expanded out to bring in more people. And the image on the left really represents what the system map told us. You probably can't read it from there, but there's lines going down. Those are the map. In the map, we said we needed to reduce coal. We needed to reduce carbon emissions. And the map also told us we needed to increase energy efficiency, increase clean energy, and then the burst was our vibrant clean energy economy and the 80% reduction goal. And that was a way to illustrate in a very simple graphic the point of what we were doing together, that these were happening at the same time and they were leading to this goal. And it ended up being part of really what our logo is over time. But we also did some work on messaging. We went out and we hired experts. That's something that REAMP's always done, is reached out to people who had expertise, facilitation and systems mapping and messaging, and built the capacity of the whole network by inviting people in to help talk about these questions. This was early in 2004, 2005, and the dialogue was so different. The discussion was so different than what it is now. People were saying you couldn't say climate change in the Midwest. People didn't agree that there was actually a problem. That's radically changed, not enough, of course, but it has. And so we really learned that some of the language in the environmental sector wasn't the right communication for messaging this big idea out to a broader audience. And so there was that type of work. In communications, again, this was early, 2004-ish, 2005. The idea of network systems, it's all about the relationships and the flow of information and the ability to work quickly through learning and iterating. And we put together a an online network, which at the time was quite different and foreign to many people working in that space. We've gone through 4 different iterations of that because the technology has changed, the whole social structure of how we communicate has changed. And so we've been able to learn and build and improve how we collaborate over distance, 8 states, 160 or so organizations at this point. Distributed leadership and infrastructure has been a commitment that we've stuck to. The shared assets, as we call them, continue to be placed within the organizations, not in a separate organization or a central hub. And we are constantly thinking about thinking better together by acting like a network. We have learned lessons that that's something that you need to cultivate constantly as new people come into the way of working together. You need to onboard them, have orientation, have ways of them experiencing this different way of working, that they're not there representing their single organization or their single issue. And with this structure of the flexibility of these nodes and shared assets, as I mentioned, the minimal structure has allowed us to continually adapt. And now, you know, some years later, I think I'll let Rick show you sort of where the network is now. There's a lot of moving parts, and we're going into a new era of ramping it up, hopefully quite significantly. Still based, holding on to these important principles. Some of the things that are principles that all of you understand that we really baked into our design were these concepts of stability. You need just enough, but then you need a lot of flexibility and randomness for emergence to happen. The connectivity has to be open, transparent, and there needs to be multiple loops. It can't be a very prescribed, this is the way communication happens for us to work together. Diversity, distributed, it's a font of creativity to bring in new ideas, to bring in different people where there's creative tension. Information flow is critical for emergence to happen. If there isn't a free flow of information, the ideas don't percolate up from the whole network. We've seen over the years of gathering all the advocates together annually that inevitably there is a big emergent new idea that comes out of those meetings that moves the network forward. Power differential, I think Rick's going to talk a little bit about that. We talk about the funding advocate relationship, and having too much control on any one power part, as we all understand, is in the way of change. We need to learn how to bring people to the table as equals to work together. I spoke of minimum specs, and then the question of measurement. There's, you know, especially dealing with funding sources, with talking about whether this model succeeds. We need to be realistic about what's possible to measure in complex, adaptive, long-term social change. And in systems, it's about looking for patterns. It's about understanding patterns and watching for emergence. And that's something that is really, we don't necessarily have all the tools to do, but we're always looking for them. And we've had a number of experiments where we're aggregating information and visualizing it, sharing information. And that's one of the things that I hope to talk to so many of you over the next few hours. I'm honored to be here with so many of you who are doing this work deeply, and I'm looking forward to sharing more of our learning. Thanks.